When you only have two parties, it's hard to imagine that two parties can really represent the diversity of political views that exist in a modern society. And I think it leaves a lot of people feeling politically homeless. Super donors were responsible for nearly half of all the donations that went to political parties in the UK. Each of those super donors giving somewhere close to £500,000 each. And I think, again, if we come back to the basic principle of democracy being one of political equality, it's just obvious that is the most blatant violation you can imagine of that kind of principle. There are impeccably liberal arguments for abolishing state schools. You don't need to be an authoritarian socialist to think that that's the right thing to do.
Daniel Chandler, hello, how's it going?
Hello, very good, thank you.
Very glad to have you here. Your book, Free and Equal.
Yes,
Ta-da!
this again.
What Would a Fair Society Look Like is out in a week's time.
It is.
The traditional refrain, or the one you kind of quite often hear, is free or equal, not and. Mm-hmm. So why do you reject the concepts of freedom and equality being mutually exclusive?
That is a great question. I think, we typically, in the history of thought and also in politics, there's this division between a kind of liberal tradition that prizes freedom and is often willing to sacrifice equality in order to achieve it, and then a socialist tradition that's all about equality but has sometimes been willing to sacrifice freedom. And I think most people recognize that the two ought to go together in some sense. What I've tried to do in this book is show exactly how they do fit together, and I've done that drawing on a political philosopher called John Rawls, who is, by a long way the most important political thinker of the 20th century, a thinker who's routinely compared to some of the most well-known, recognizable names in the history of Western thought, from Plato to Hobbes, Kant, Marx, John Stuart Mill. He's kind of up there in that pantheon. And in a sense, his great philosophical achievement was to bring those two traditions together, a sort of synthesis of the best of the liberal and socialist traditions, and to bring the values of freedom and equality into a coherent whole. And I think that is worth doing because I think it fits with most people's intuitions about how we should organize our societies. And it's also, that's the starting point in the book for then thinking through a whole practical agenda for what that would all mean in practice.
Also, this idea within Rawls is thinking about the veil of ignorance, and if we were to try and create a society and we didn't know where we would sit in that society, what is the society we would create? And presumably the outcome of that would be the most free and, if you wanted to impose morality on it, ethically right one, because if you didn't know where you would sit, you obviously wouldn't want the lot of the worst off in society to be dramatically different from the rest in case you ended up in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. I think that thought experiment that Rawls had, he calls it the original position. So he says, if you want to know what a fair society would look like, you should imagine how you would choose to organize it if you didn't know which person or what your position would be in that society, whether you would be rich or poor, gay or straight, black or white. And I think it's such an incredibly powerful and intuitive thought experiment. I think it's one of those things that once you've sort of got it in your head, you sort of never let go of it. And it captures something very intuitive about the idea of fairness. It's just like how you might expect someone to cut a cake more fairly if they didn't know which piece they would get in the end. It's exactly that idea but applied to society as a whole. And for Rawls, what he does is use that experiment as a way to justify these principles that are really as I said, before. As I said before, what the practical thing that we get from Rawls are these three principles: freedom, equality, and sustainability. And the thought experiment is really a way of showing how we arrive at those principles. So rather than just saying, there are these principles, I'm a philosopher, and I sort of told you so, and you must go ahead and do them. He's like, actually, there's we all share this notion that society should be fair, is one that's really shared right across the political spectrum, but it can feel like this impossibly vague and nebulous idea. And here's a very practical, intuitive thought experiment for sort of going from the nebulous idea of fairness to something more concrete. And for Rawls, that concrete thing are those three principles, and then that's the starting point for all of the practical stuff that we get from him, and in a sense for the rest of my book.
We'll come to the second part of the title, What Would a Fair Society Look Like?
Yes.
Imminently. Mm-hmm. But let's start with society as it is. Why do we need to change the status quo? What's wrong with it? Why do we need to change society?
Well, I think there's two things that we need to address. The first is just a lack of ideas about what society ought to look like. I think it's very easy to point to all of the problems, poverty, inequality, climate and ecological emergency, culture wars, democracy in crisis. It's like a very long list, I suppose. That's, in a sense, that's the answer to your question. But I think what's missing, and in a way what the book is trying to bring to our political conversation, is a coherent vision of what a better, fairer society would actually look like. I think, often feels like we're just buffeted from one crisis to another without any kind of longer-term sense of vision or direction. I think it's in moments like that where we are missing a sense of direction that philosophy really comes into its own. Philosophy can help us to think about what our values are, where it is that we want to be heading. But I think the problem that we face today is we don't really know where to look for that kind of inspiration. I think in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the politicians who in many ways have shaped the ideas that still dominate our political discourse today to a greater or lesser extent, they could look to thinkers like Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman, names that we're still, more or less familiar with today. And I think it's hard to know exactly where to look for that kind of inspiration. And again, that's where this thinker John Rawls comes in, because it's from Rawls that we really get a vision of what a better, fairer society would look like. Though I feel like I slightly didn't quite answer your question. I jumped straight to the second part of
it was great. It was fantastic.
Title,
and I think
I can talk more about the problems.
We'll get there. Don't worry. I think the sort of, you're right. We sort of feel like we're veering from crisis to crisis, that our politics is almost sort of a battle of technocrats over a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
There aren't, maybe in the way that in 2019 there were sort of two grand ideas. It was a very clear electoral contest between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson. Mm-hmm. And that politics doesn't have that feel right now. Mm-hmm. But there are grand ideas, and Rawls has grand ideas. Mm-hmm. So why? Why John Rawls? What was it about his philosophy that drew you to him? And sort of, the first half of the book is engaging with his philosophy, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Why Rawls?
Why Rawls? So, I think in a sense the answer is kind of simple. I don't think there is another thinker in the past 100 years who has set out such a systematic and constructive philosophy about, the question on the cover of the book, what a fair society would look like. I think what makes him really exciting is, partly he's exciting because he's got this incredible status. Everyone, at least within academia, Rawls is this kind of godlike figure within academic political philosophy. And so one thing that's exciting is, knowing that actually most people who are interested in politics don't yet know about his ideas, bringing them out of academia and sort of into our public debate. That's kind of exciting in its own right. But, obviously, really what's exciting is the content of his ideas and the way that they don't just criticize the way that our societies are, important though that is. They set out a vision of what a better society would actually look like. And, what we get from Rawls, the sort of practical thing that you get from reading his ideas, are a set of principles. He talks about two fundamental principles, one to do with freedom, one to do with equality, hence the title of the book and the discussion we had earlier about freedom and equality. There's also actually a third principle that to do with sustainability. And it's together those three principles, freedom, equality, sustainability, they give us, they're like a kind of a toolkit that each of us can use for thinking through, both big picture questions like what's wrong with our societies, where do we want to go, but also just thinking through the kinds of issues that come up every time we read the news, like how can we protect free speech without allowing hatred and disinformation to flourish, or how can we organize our democracy so that everyone has an equal say, even in a society of millions or billions of people, and crucially also how can we reorganize our economy. So I think what drew me to Rawls is the sense that he has answers to those questions and isn't just highlighting problems.
I'd like to take each of those areas in turn over the course of this interview, talk about the problems and the solutions that they merit. And one of the, as you mentioned, one of the key areas for dramatic improvement is democracy. So what don't you like about democracy? Or to be less accusatory, what's wrong with our democracy?
Yeah. So, it's not that everything is wrong with, democracy is a good system. Most people want to live in a democratic society. I think 90% of people in the UK think democracy is good in theory, but less than 20% think that it's working in practice. And, I think there are lots of reasons why that is the case. I think one problem is the voting system. I think that first past the post, which is the voting system that we have here, it leads politicians to focus in a completely disproportionate way on marginal constituencies, the constituencies that are likely to change hands from one election to the next. And it means that voters who are living in those particular areas get an enormous amount of attention, and there's a lot of attention paid to their views. And at the moment, the red wall seats are the sort of particular focus of political attention here. And that other voters who live in safe seats that haven't changed hands for a long time are basically ignored. And if the basic principle of democracy is one of political equality, of everyone having an equal chance to take part in and influence the political process, then that just doesn't seem like a very good voting system. It also leads to a politics that tends to be dominated by two parties. In a first past the post system, it's very hard for small parties to make any kind of headway. And I think that's a problem too, because when you only have two parties, it's hard to imagine that two parties can really represent the diversity of political views that exist in a modern society. And I think it leaves a lot of people feeling politically homeless. And again, that's not a good system. So I think that's one part of the problem, and I think the solution to that is to embrace proportional representation. And I can't remember, was your question more about problems or solutions?
Problems first.
We'll stick with problems.
Yeah,
okay. I'm always wanting to get to
solutions
solutions. That's
too right.
That's the sort of spirit of the book, is to move towards solutions rather than focus on problems. But the other, maybe even bigger problem is the role of money in politics. And in the 2019 election, just over 100 super donors were responsible for nearly half of all the donations that went to political parties in the UK. Each of those super donors giving somewhere close to £500,000 each. And I think, again, if we come back to the basic principle of democracy being one of political equality, it's just obvious that is the most blatant violation you can imagine of that kind of principle. And it gives the rich a very direct influence over politics that the rest of us don't have, and it means that parties are geared towards the interests and the preferences of this rich and unrepresentative donor class rather than the majority of the population who they should be paying attention to. So I would say those are the two biggest problems: the voting system and the role of money in politics.
So let's talk about proportional representation, and then we'll come to sort of private money's negative effects on our political systems. With proportional representation, there are some sort of European democracies you can look at and that have systems more representative than our own. Are you concerned that those systems, they obviously create a lot of coalitions, and sometimes you can sort of end up in a situation where almost the tail ends up wagging the dog, if you know what I mean. The minority partner in the coalition, critics will say, secures undue influence as the kingmaker in those systems. So what's the case for proportional representation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the basic case for proportional representation is that under proportional representation, every vote counts equally regardless of where it's cast. So that's the fundamental argument in favour. I think one of the, no voting system is perfect. Every system has drawbacks, and we have to sort of decide what our priorities are. I think the tendency for the downside of proportional systems is that you can have a proliferation of lots of different parties, and that there's much more of a focus on coalition building. But I think we shouldn't overestimate or sort of overdo how different that is actually to first past the post. Even in first past the post, we have a couple of big parties, but those parties are really coalitions of different factions representing different views, and there's all sorts of behind-the-scenes negotiations that are happening within those parties. So it's not that there's no coalition building going on, or that small groups aren't able to wield outside influence. It's just that all of that stuff is kind of happening out of sight. So I think, in a way, what proportional representation does is bring all of that out into the open, and negotiation between coalitions, coalition building, that's what democracy is about. That's how you govern in a society where people hold different views. You just sort of conjured an image of the ERG and the Conservative Party into my head there, and saying that was a fair point. So I should have used that example. Thank you. You can take it. Put it in your pocket. So let's talk about funding.
for political parties? What's the answer? Is it state funding? Is it, you get a certain amount of cash from the state, that's all you get to run an election? How do you propose resolving that problem?
Yeah, so I think some form of state funding has to be the solution, but I think the conventional model of state funding isn't a very good one. So typically the way that works is that parties will be given a certain amount of money based on their share of the votes in the last election. And the biggest problem with that is that it makes it very hard for new parties to sort of enter the fray. Because if they haven't won seats in the last election, then how are they going to get any funding? And without any funding, how are they going to win any seats in the next election? It's kind of a terrible catch-22 situation. So I think a much better system would be what I call a democracy voucher system, where you give every citizen a certain amount of money, say £50 per year, that they can give directly to the political party of their choice. And I think, the great advantage of that is that it puts the question of funding right into citizens' hands, and it, just in a stroke ensures political equality. I should say, I think it's important to combine that with a cap on private donations. So the sort of system as a whole would be one where individuals can give privately possibly a small amount of money, I'd say in the maximum of the low couple of hundreds of pounds, or maybe nothing at all. And the focus would then shift to this system of democracy vouchers where people can give, donate to the party of their choice. And, I think that would just completely transform the incentives that exist in our political system. So rather than parties chasing after this rich and unrepresentative donor class, they would have to appeal equally to all of us. And it would also give people another opportunity just to get engaged in politics. It would lead to people, it's just another moment in the year where you have to engage with politics, where you might talk to your friends about, which party you think has got the best policies. It also means that parties might, that you can imagine parties organising fundraising events that actually draw in normal people and not just like whoever the latest billionaire is. Actually, I'm relying on you to give me a good example. I could only think of Jeff Bezos, who's probably too unrepresentative to really be relevant. But anyway, you get the idea. And I think it sounds like, would be a very big change from the system that we have at the moment. But I think in practical terms, there's really no reason why we couldn't introduce it. And interestingly, having been a kind of philosopher's pipe dream for a while, that system now exists in Seattle in America. So in 2017, they introduced a democracy voucher system after a local referendum, and that system governs local elections, rather than national elections there. And they've now run 3 elections under that system, and it works really well, and the consequences are exactly what you would expect. More people getting involved in donating to parties, particularly people who didn't give money before, and also those elections being more competitive, which is really so important. You have more people standing and more challengers beating incumbents, and that kind of, it's in a democracy, it's that competition between politicians that really ensures a link between representatives and the people that they're representing. So, I think that's a system that has worked very well there, and there's really no reason why we shouldn't extend it to the national level.
Fascinating. Shall we talk a little bit about equality?
Let's.
Okay, so let's start things off. Do we have equality of opportunity in the United Kingdom?
No.
Why?
No, I think there's no question that we don't, really, despite the amount that we, it's kind of amazing. We hear so much talk about equality of opportunity, and as if we live in a meritocracy, and as if that's happened, and it's obviously it's an idea that has appeal right across the spectrum. But despite that, the UK is one of the worst countries in the rich world when it comes to equality of opportunity. When you look at the link between how much money people's parents had and how much they go on to earn as adults, the link is just extremely strong. So if your parents, so it's basically about 50% of what people earn as adults can more or less be predicted just by looking at what their parents earned when they were children. So,
wow.
If you imagine someone, if your parents earn £10,000 more per year than your friends, then when you go on to be an adult, you're likely to earn £5,000 more than your friends. That's roughly sort of how much it works out. And that, that's a very strong relationship, and I think, that's really that fact. There are probably all sorts of other ways to describe it too. But that's the sort of the evidence that we clearly don't live in a society where we have achieved equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity is a very radical goal. I think, sometimes people on the left are critical of equality of opportunity because it's sometimes presented as an alternative to caring about inequality more widely. And I think they're right, we need to care about both of them. But I think that shouldn't take away from a recognition that even on its own, equality of opportunity is a really, is a very difficult thing to achieve. Difficult, but not impossible. And there's clearly a lot more that we could do to move in that direction.
So what are the causes of it then in modern Britain? What's sort of propagating that? Not just the inequality of opportunity, but also propagating it through the generations. Why is that happening?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. Partly it is just a consequence of the inequality that exists in our societies. And, as I said before, people sometimes draw a distinction between equality of opportunity and then inequality more widely. But the two are obviously really connected. Or maybe actually a better way to put it is that people draw a distinction between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And when you think about it, what is pretty quickly clear is that outcomes for parents are basically opportunities for children. And it's the fact that lots of children grow up in households with not very much money, or with parents who are, struggling to make ends meet or to heat the house, or juggling various jobs, experiencing a lot of stress. Those are just conditions in which children will inevitably struggle to either to develop their skills and abilities at home through talking to their parents or to make the most of schooling. So, I think a big part of the problem is just the inequality that exists in our society. And if we really want true equality of opportunity, we need to address that directly. But I think it's also the school system. The school system, in a sense, is the best tool, the most direct tool that we have for addressing the lack of opportunity in our societies today. And it's meant to be this great leveler, but unfortunately it's not doing that job today. In children from poorer households, in fact there was a recent report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies where I actually used to work, and it's typically for them an incredibly comprehensive, rigorous study. There's sort of no question about the quality of the data or the facts. And what's really clear is that children from poorer backgrounds do worse at every single stage of the education system. As soon as children get into school, there's already a gap between children from rich and poor backgrounds, and it just gets wider. What you would hope is that maybe it gets narrower, but we don't completely eliminate it, and actually it keeps getting wider. And by the time it gets to university, and access to university is obviously so important for the kinds of jobs that people go on to do, how much money they earn, their status in society. Maybe the fact that university is so important for that is also a problem in itself, but but basically children from poor backgrounds, or children from the richest 20% of households, are 3 times more likely than those from the poorest 20% to go to university at all, and 6 times more likely to go to one of the more elite and selective universities. So, again, I think it's clear that the school system isn't doing its job. And I mean, maybe just to add one thing, I think the sort of elephant in the room there is really the role of private schools. I think that is one of the most serious obstacles to equality of opportunity that we face, and the one where there seems to be the least political will to do anything serious about it. So something like, I think 7% of children in the UK go to a private school, but people who've been to private school go on to earn much more than their state-educated peers. So on average, by the time people who've been to private school are in their 30s, they're earning 40% more on average than otherwise similar state-educated peers. And they also dominate the upper echelons of almost all of the most prestigious and well-paid professions. So 2/3 of senior judges went to private schools, nearly half of politicians, nearly half of newspaper columnists. I think it's about 1/3 of business leaders. And, I think that is another huge problem and something that we really need to do something about.
Solutions then.
So yes, as you could tell, I was rearing to get into solutions, but I held back.
I respect it.
Because it's, otherwise I'll just talk forever. Solutions.
Yeah, so private schools, what is it? Removing their charitable status, abolishing them? What do you reckon?
Yeah, so I think removing their charitable status is just a no-brainer. There's absolutely no reason why the state should be subsidizing a system that so directly undermines one of the most important principles that people share right across the political spectrum. But in Free and Equal, I argue that we should go further and that we should abolish them, which is what actually happened in Finland in the 1970s. So we also have a good example of a country where that did take place. In Finland in the 70s, they changed the constitution to prevent schools from charging fees for basic education, basically for education during sort of compulsory years. And the Finnish education system, it hasn't collapsed. There's been no terrible decline in quality. If anything, the opposite. The Finnish education system is one of the best in the world. There are these international studies of test scores that are done every year, and Finland is, always at or near the top of those test scores. So of those league tables. So we know that a system without private schools can work incredibly well, and can work as part of a free and liberal society, which is what Finland is today. I think a lot of people, particularly liberals, recoil a bit from the idea of abolishing private schools. I think there's an idea that it's somehow the first step down the route to some kind of authoritarian socialist nightmare. And I think part of my aim in the book, which, as we've discussed, is drawing on this philosopher John Rawls, and Rawls is really the great liberal philosopher of the 20th century. And what I'm trying to do is show that there are impeccably liberal arguments for abolishing state schools. You don't need to be an authoritarian socialist to think that that's the right thing to do. And also that it's not an attack on parents. It's not an attack even on the parents who send their children to private schools. There's nothing wrong with parents wanting the best for their children. And in the system that we have today, it's totally understandable that people who have the resources would want their children to go to the best schools. The problem is with the system overall, and I think, that's what we need to focus on changing.
And when we're talking about the other, I think you said 7%, right?
Yeah,
private
7%.
Schools. So the other 93% who,
Yeah.
as you said, there's kind of that widening of inequality of outcomes, particularly between the
Yeah.
two, the richest and the poorest. How do we go about addressing that? If we deal with let's say we've dealt with the private school problem,
Yes.
job done.
Imagine.
What about everyone
Easy.
else? What are we doing there?
Yeah. So I think, the most important thing within the school system is to target resources at the children who need it most, also the areas where there are the highest levels of disadvantage. And we do have a system that is roughly along those lines here in the UK. So the coalition government in the 2010s introduced something called the pupil premium, which gave schools extra funding depending on the number of children they had from disadvantaged backgrounds. Unfortunately, the amount of extra funding has actually gone down over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and I think that the basic structure of that system is right, but we're just not spending enough. The amount of extra funding just isn't sufficient at the moment. Also, we have to think, it's not just you can throw money at schools and assume that outcomes will improve. You also need to think carefully about where that money is spent. But we shouldn't think that there's nothing that we can do. There's a lot of good evidence about things like one-to-one tuition being incredibly effective for helping disadvantaged students catch up. The quality of teachers is incredibly important. And, unfortunately at the moment, what often is the case is that the most qualified teachers end up in the schools with the most advantaged students, when really we would want it to be the other way around. But again, we know how to change that. You can incentivize teachers, you can offer better pay and more support for people to work in schools that really need them most. And I think in South Korea they've done exactly that and achieved what you would expect. I think in South Korea, it's maths teachers, the sort of best qualified maths teachers are now disproportionately in the schools with the most disadvantaged students, and it's having all of the results that you would want and expect. So I think, that's probably within the school system, the most important thing is to target resources on the least advantaged. But ultimately, I think we have to recognise that there is a limit to how much the school system is ever going to be able to do, which brings us back to the question about inequality, which we were discussing before. There's only so much that, if children are growing up in seriously disadvantaged households, in the end, the school system is never going to be able to compensate that. So I think we can't pin all of our hope on the school system, even though there's a lot more that we can do there.
Let's delve into inequality then. Since the Second World War, our national income has tripled, but it is not evenly distributed, is it? So could you set out, as we've done for these other topics,
yes.
let's set out the situation as it stands, and then we'll move to how we're going to deal with it.
Yes. I wish I had the statistic about how much the income of the least well-off in society has gone up since the Second World War. I imagine it would be much less than having tripled.
I'm sure.
Basically the problem is that economic growth in our society, or the economic prosperity and the benefits of economic growth, are just incredibly unequally distributed, and that's got worse. There was a big spike. So over the post-war period, from the sort of 50s to the 80s, there was actually quite a big decline in inequality. But since in the 80s, there was this massive jump, and inequality has sort of stayed at that much higher level ever since. The lack of, the focus of economic policy over that period has just been on increasing economic growth, without really thinking very much about how it's distributed. And I think that's really that and the climate emergency are the two biggest problems that we face with our economic system today.
Yeah, and its extractive nature, and obviously it affects the just savings principle, right, that Rawls advocates for. So.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, you really have read the book.
I have in fact read
its least known principle as well. I feel like there are lots of people who know about Rawls who don't know about the just savings principle, so you've totally
read the book and they'll find out all about it.
Yeah.
So we'll come to that, but we were talking about inequality, and you mentioned the phrase great leveller earlier.
Yeah.
And obviously Walter Scheidel, he writes this book, The Great Leveller, and he argues that throughout all of human history there are only 4 proven ways to reduce inequality. And they are mass mobilization warfare, deadly plagues, the complete collapse of the state, and I think the other one is violent revolution. And obviously you can understand the subtext of all of that is basically tons of people have to die in order for inequality to actually meaningfully be reduced. You suggest that actually we can tackle inequality at source in our society. So would you like to set out the case for why we don't all need to die in some bloody conflict in order for that to be the case?
Yeah. Yes, my God, what a pessimistic view to have of
deeply upsetting and nihilistic.
I think there are lots of practical ways that we can change our economic institutions that would lead to more equality. I imagine, the argument that you were just mentioning, in a sense, is probably it's less that we don't know how to do it, but more that it's very difficult to create the political will to do the things that we know need to happen. And I think, often it has been crises or war that have led to this kind of political change. And I think particularly the experience of, as I mentioned before, that the post-war period being this period where inequality did go down. It's no coincidence that it happened after the Second World War. And what happened in the Second World War is that people had, felt like they were part of a national community. They had a sort of sense of shared purpose and shared identity and shared values. And a sense that they had overcome an existential threat and wanted to create a better society. And I think it is a genuinely difficult question how you create that sense of common purpose without war. I don't think it's an easy question to answer, in a sense that is the challenge for politicians in a way. It's not only the role for politicians. I think it's also something for everyone who's thinking and writing about politics, and maybe for all of us to get involved and try to make that happen. But politicians, obviously, it's their primary role. That's if they're there to do anything, it should be that they are there to do that.
To lead.
To lead, exactly. And I think the challenge of politics and of philosophy is to try to bring about, I was going to say the consequences of war, but actually we don't want the consequences of war.
No, we don't.
That would be terrible. But to bring about that kind of change without war.
Yes, absolutely.
And And I suppose the bit that I've tried to contribute towards that in the book is to set out the practical things that we actually could do to make our economy more fair and more equal. Because I guess the other, there's a lack of political will, but there's also just a pessimism, I think, in our societies about the possibility of any kind of large-scale economic change, as if our kind of economic institutions are just fixed. There's like Thatcher's "there is no alternative." I think that idea is kind of seeped into our national consciousness, and not just ours, in a very deep way. And so I think just showing that other countries have done things differently, and that other people have really good ideas about alternative ways to organize our economy, reviving that sense of optimism and possibility, that is also, I think, a precondition for bringing about any kind of meaningful change.
Goes back to what you mentioned at the beginning, Hayek and Friedman, sort of setting the parameters of the political debate and consensus for decades.
Yeah, and I think they really grasped the power of ideas in a way that maybe thinkers and politicians haven't quite today. I think it's there's a sense that all we do is, you should just think about practical technical solutions to the problem that's just in front of us. And I think often we do need to do that. And, small marginal changes can be helpful. But yeah, I think in a way we can look to Milton Friedman and Hayek as an example for how much influence big ideas can have too, and how lasting that influence can be.
You mentioned practical measures in your last answer.
Which I've been avoiding, actually, talking about somehow.
Let's do it now.
Let's
go. So what are the levers that we can pull to try and reduce this significant wealth inequality?
Yeah. So I think, as you said, I think what we should be aiming to do, and where I think rules helpfully points us towards, is not just relying on redistribution to solve all our problems. I think that has been the paradigm that's dominated progressive economic thinking for quite a long time. And I think that paradigm has some problems. I think one problem is that when we rely on redistribution alone, there's a sense that the reciprocity, the sense of that people contributing and receiving in some kind of fair exchange, contributing to society and then receiving something fair back in return, that can be lost. So I think moving beyond redistribution is important for reciprocity, but it's also important because having work is an important part of giving people a sense of meaning and identity and dignity in their lives. And I think, again, part of what's exciting about Rawls is that when he thinks about inequality, he's very clear that questions, that money matters, but dignity and self-respect are also incredibly important. And that points us towards thinking about the importance of work and moving beyond redistribution. So moving beyond redistribution, I'm being very slow to get to the practical ideas, even though I promise you they are there. You've read the book, so you know. But so I think if we want to move beyond redistribution and tackle inequality more at its source, there's really two main ways to do that. One, we need to focus on increasing the earnings of the least well-off, and the most important way to do that is to invest more in the skills that people have. In a market economy, the most important determinant of how much people earn are those skills, what economists call their human capital. Slightly inhuman phrase, but I guess the word human is there to suggest people. So yeah, I think, and I think in particular, we've paid too much attention to investing in universities and not enough to how we support the more than half of the population who don't go to university. And again, we haven't sort of delved so much into Rawls' principles, but his guiding principle for thinking about economic justice, just to take a little side diversion, is this principle that he calls the difference principle, which is the idea that we should organize our economy in a way so that the least well-off in society are better off than they would be under any alternative system. So, it strongly focuses us on how the least well-off are doing, and the least well-off are not the people who are going to university, they're the people who don't go to university. So I think if we want to bring about a more equal distribution of earnings, then the first thing we should do is really invest much, much more in vocational education and in the people who don't go to university. I think we have to combine that with measures that would equalize the bargaining power between workers and employers in the labour market. So There are things we can do like, minimum wages do that in a kind of blunt way, and that can help right at the bottom. But I think there's also a role for trade unions and collective bargaining over pay. In the UK, that has kind of almost disappeared over the last few decades, but it still exists in pretty strong health in a lot of European countries, and even institutions like the OECD, which is this sort of international think tank that is not a sort of economically radical left-wing institution, recognize that collective bargaining can both reduce inequality and support prosperity by bringing workers and employers around the table to try and advance a mutually beneficial agenda. So I think there's a kind of whole package of slightly bitty things that we can do to raise earnings. Bitty, but not unimportant for that. I think the other part of the picture is to bring about a much more equal distribution of wealth. I think that's something that has been kind of overlooked in our politics, but it's becoming even more important as we face a kind of technological revolution, and as more money and profits end up going to the people who own the machines that are becoming increasingly important for production. I think this question of who owns those machines and who benefits from those profits is it's only going to become more important. There are various different ways that we could try to bring about a more equal distribution of wealth and ownership. One idea would be to have a universal minimum inheritance, which would need to be funded by taxes on the very wealthiest people in society, and I think you could have a combination of annual wealth taxes on the very wealthiest households each year, plus inheritance taxes. But either way, you could use that to fund a very substantial minimum inheritance that would really set people up for life in a way that at the moment is only true for people from the richest backgrounds. The other alternative, which actually I make a stronger case for in the book, is for what's known as a citizens' wealth fund, basically where the state would purchase shares in companies and other assets on behalf of citizens, and then build up basically a big portfolio of assets that are owned on behalf of citizens as a whole. And like any other financial portfolio, that would generate income and interest every year, and that could then be paid to citizens as a way of at least partly funding a universal basic income, which is another idea that I discuss in the book. And I think that, in a way, that has some advantages over the minimum inheritance scheme. It gets a little bit technical, but the main advantage is that it would ensure that there is a high level of overall savings in society, which can be important for investment and productivity growth over the long run. But again, in political terms, that would be very difficult because it would require significantly increasing taxes on the wealthy, who would obviously resist that very strongly. But in practical terms, again, there's no major obstacle. Loads of countries have sovereign wealth funds, which are in some cases absolutely massive. Norway, I think, is the country with the biggest sovereign wealth fund. And I'm going to forget the statistic. I'll remember for my next interview. But it's something like 4 times their national income is the total size of that fund. Is absolutely massive. And what's attractive, I think, about this idea is that it's a way of redistributing wealth whilst maintaining a dynamic market economy, which is exactly what Norway has. It's not returning to the sort of top-down nationalization of the post-war period with all of the problems that had. What this fund would do is buy maybe a maximum of 10% of the shares in lots of companies. It's not seeking to control those companies, but just to make sure that some share of the profits that they earn can be distributed to everyone. So I think that would be that redistributing wealth is the other part of that puzzle, and that would be the best way to do it.
Would you be able to tell me a little bit more about universal basic income? Excuse me, because I'm obviously aware of it as a concept, and I think you almost in the same hand, or perhaps if you've got UBI in one, you've sort of got universal basic services in the other, where they can, well, maybe not, but perhaps end up with the same outcomes, where if there is genuinely affordable housing being created, if utilities are provided at cost price, if public transport is free, if leisure and cultural activities are also provided free, you can kind of, instead of just going cash direct, spend it as you wish, you're kind of achieving possibly the same outcome, i.e., you know, we're reducing your utilities, your housing's going down, so we're putting more money into your pay packet because you don't have to spend as much. How do you see those two ideas stacking up against each other, and what do you think is the best case in your view for universal basic income?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think both ideas are very attractive and both would definitely be a massive improvement over the status quo. I think, you know, the gap between either of those and where we are now is much bigger than the difference between those two ideas. I also don't think it's an either or question. You know, I make the case in Free and Equal for introducing a universal basic income, but I don't think that when we introduce it, we should scrap all public services. There are really good reasons, particularly when it comes to education and healthcare, why those should be at least funded and mostly directly provided by the state. And the right level for a basic income will depend on what those services are. You know, if we took away funding for education and healthcare, you would need a higher basic income. And I think, you know, so we should be looking to some combination of the two anyway. That is actually, I suppose that's what I'm advocating for. I think the appeal of a universal basic income is just that it trusts people to know best trust that people know best what they want and need in their lives. And, you know, I think in a way, if all we wanted to do was eliminate poverty, a universal basic income would not be the best way to do it. You can always eliminate poverty more cheaply by targeting your benefits on the people who have the least money. So if there's the case for a universal basic income comes from recognizing the way in which a very targeted welfare system can undermine the sense of dignity and self-respect that the people who have the least in society experience in their lives. And I think, you know, that's, you know, I guess the reasons for that are obvious. That a very targeted welfare system creates stigma, and the hoops and conditionality that people, you know, including people who are leading incredibly stressful lives, have to jump through, really makes life very difficult and leads to all sorts of mental health problems. So, you know, I think that's why if we want a universal basic income rather than a targeted kind of system, we want it because we care not just about giving people enough money, but about supporting people's sense of dignity and self-respect. And I think in a sense it follows from that we should also want to trust people as much as possible to decide for themselves how they spend their money.
So for me, I guess a big challenge to these ideas is that if we accept that we live in a liberal democracy right now, and these Rawlsian ideas and the thesis of the book again is liberal democracy, but better liberal democracy. If we accept that the outcomes we currently have, the problems that we have in our society have been delivered by liberal democracy, is the answer to do liberal democracy better, or is it to, you know, baby out with the bathwater, complete reset, whatever that system is? Don't ask me, I don't know. But is the answer to our problems to basically reform or replace? Is I guess what I'm asking you.
Yeah, I think the answer is to reform. Not least because I can't, as you say, I don't know what a replacement is. Maybe it's possible there's a better replacement. I don't want to rule it out since you haven't, you know, maybe it's logically possible.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, what's helpful about, you know, Rawls's ideas is that it takes us back to these sort of some basic first principles. And, you know, he has these two core principles to do with freedom and equality. And that first freedom principle, the idea that we need to protect people's basic freedoms, and those include both personal, you know, those are the sort of personal freedoms, the freedoms like freedom of religion, speech, sexuality, and then political freedoms, which are basically the freedoms that underpin the democratic process. Those are the two components of liberal democracy. The liberal part is the personal freedoms, the democracy part is the political freedoms. And I don't think any society could be a good society or a just society without those freedoms. So actually I'm going to go back on I think there's no question of replacing liberal democracy. I think the only thing that we can do is try to make it better. And I think that is possible, you know, and in a way that the whole purpose of the book is to revive a sense that liberal democracy is not kind of doomed and fatally flawed, which I think is sometimes the tendency for people who are dissatisfied with our society to kind of go to that conclusion and just despair. And, I'm sympathetic to that feeling because I also feel really frustrated with the way that things are, but I don't think they will get better just by despairing. I think the way to make them better is to come up with ideas about what it would look like for them to be better, and then to go out and try to make that happen.
Daniel Chandler, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks
Free and
for
Equal.
having me.
Yeah, very glad to have you here. Free and Equal out April 20th.
20th of April, exactly, yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Okay,
I really
thank you.
appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Your book, Free and Equal. Ta-da! What would a fair society look like? That's extraordinary. Who's pulling that? That's never happened before.
I presume.
No.
Oh, it's my book. They were really. That's quite nice. It's nice timing.
That's extraordinary. I think we might have to leave this in. Come on.
Oh, watch out! It's gonna
Imagine if it's
spray
not.
you in dust.
Yeah, it's full of anthrax from Penguin. Oh my gosh,
no.
I'm being covered in
Yeah,
dust.
I've made that mistake in an excess of enthusiasm.
Here we go. We're double-headed.
Double.
It's almost like we conjured it into existence just
Yeah.
to mention the name.